So let's begin and daven that the zchut of our learning should protect our soldiers and Am Yisrael everywhere and all the innocents and bring um, peace speedily in our time. Yeah. Okay, what I had mentioned, it came up a couple of weeks ago when we were learning the Gemara. In the Gemara, we had the Bright of Rebbe. That's not the right Gemara. Just a second. We had the Bright of Rebbe, and Rebbe said, this is not what's on the screen right now. I'm just going to read it. Rebbe said, Al kol aveirot shebatorah ben asat tshuva ben lo asat tshuva Yoma kippurim mechaper chutz miporek or megale panim b'torah mefer brit basar shem asat tshuva Yoma kippurim mechaper and lo asat tshuva in Yoma kippurim mechaper. So Rashi explained um, what were these three things that even according to Rebbe, one must do tshuva in order to gain kapara. So the first one is Parek Ol. And in our girsa here, that's in parentheses, in round parentheses, which usually means that that's not the favored girsa. Usually, if it's around parentheses, indicates it's not a favored girsa, and square brackets indicates that that's a favored girsa. I'm not going to dive into that so much, but we're going to look at a couple of things that are regarding that. And we talked about Megaleb Panim B'Torah, and I wanted to dive a little bit further into the meaning of Megaleb Panim B'Torah, but for the moment, I just wanted to point out, Rashi said here, what does it mean, Megaleb Panim B'Torah? Rashi said, Doesh et Torah lignai. Somebody who expounds on the Torah in a degrading way. For example, Menashe, who was Doresh Bagadot Shel Dofi. He darshan, he expounded on Agadot of Dofi, of falsehood. And Lo hayalo and Rashi brings an example. Lo hayalo l'Moshe tov ela b'timna hayta pilegesh. It says v'gomer. So I don't want to do that whole sugya, but I mentioned at the time, Rashi is basing this on Gemara in Sanhedrin. I just wanted to show you the reference that Rashi wasn't just pulling this out of a hat. This is something that Rashi saw. And Tanura Banan. So this is a drasha from Perek Chelek, right? So Perek Chelek in Sanhedrin is the Mishnah that begins Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelek Le'olam Haba, and then the rest of the Perek, interestingly, spends most of its time explaining the exceptions to that rule. In other words, generally speaking, let's say, in sharp contrast, I would say, to Christianity, where you're born with original sin. In Judaism, you're born without sin. You're born pure. That is, in this context, it means Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelek Le'olam Haba. Merely by fact that you were born into Yisrael, you start off with the privilege of, after you die, you have the privilege of going to Olam Haba. Everybody, so all of us have a portion in the world to come, but you can lose your portion in the world to come. That's the difference. You can lose your portion in the world to come. So in the Mishnah mentions, among other people who lost their chelik in Olam Haba, was Menashe. Menashe is the son of Chizkiyahu HaMelech. Chizkiyahu HaMelech, of course, is remarked upon in Sefer Melachim as being an exceptional king, that after him there wasn't anyone like him, and not even before him. However, Menashe, his son, was not a good person. But interestingly, how did he lose his chayil olam haba? Um, it's related to this braita here, Tanur Rabbanan. So Tanur Rabbanan, the rabbis learned in a braita, um, Va'nefesh asher taseh biyad ramah. So what's that in context of? Um, um, eh, eh, um, here also. All right, somebody who does something with a raised hand. In other words, in a kind of uh, overbearing way, or it does something terrible in a kind of an overbearing way. Biyad Ramah, Rashi explains b'mezid that he does it on purpose. Min ha'ezrach min hager, whether as we would say in modern terms, a citizen that is a full-fledged member of Bnei Israel, or min hager, someone who is a convert who converted into the tribe. But if he does biyad ramah, if he does sin b'mezid, et Hashem hu megadef, v'nechata nefesh ahi mikarav hamav. So he's megadef. Rashi says mecharef. In other words, somebody who insults God. I don't know how they translate it um, here. He reviles Hashem. Okay. And that person will be cut off. He'll be chayav karet. So in the Gemara that we were just looking at a moment ago, Sanhedrin, it quotes this pasuk, Hanur b'nav nefesh asher taseh biyad ramah. It says, Zeh Menashe ben Chizkiah. This is the example of this is Menashe, the son of Chizkiah. Shahaya Yoshev Doresh Bahagadot Shel Dofi. Because he sat and he darshaned Agadot of Dofi. And the um, and by doing so, he was disrespectful to, or even uh, somehow, degrading the Torah. And then it and then it gives an example of the kind of drashot he would do. And I'm not going to go into these, right? So the first one, though, is the one that Rashi alluded to. וכי לא היה למשה לכתוב, אלא ואחות לא תמנע, ותמנע הייתה לפילגש של אליפז. I'm not going to go into explain this. It's not really so important for us right now. But the point is that the idea is that Menashe, right, who was the son of Chizkiah, Chazal understood him to be someone who knew better, somebody who must have learned Torah from his father. And he used his powers for evil. He used this knowledge and his chokhmah in a way to darshan the Torah, not in a good way. So this is a subject unto itself. I'll just, without showing you inside, but the Rambam, for example, in the Igeret Teiman, he talks about a similar idea, or maybe it was precisely this idea, and he points out that someone who doesn't come to the Torah with, for lack of a better term, with a proper attitude, he can look in the Torah and darshan it for the opposite of what the Torah means. And the example he brings is, we have a pasuk that we say every day. We say, "V'avadtem lehim achirim." You will worship other gods, and you could understand that if you were not being sincere and righteous in your understanding, you could say, oh, there's a command to worship other gods, because the future tense and the command tense are essentially the same in Hebrew. So of course we know the actual context is that this could happen, right? That you could leave God and you could come to worship other gods. But if you just take that one pasuk out of context, you could say there's a command to worship other gods. And so we know that that's not the intent of the Torah. We know that because of many other references in the Torah. It's not just because we have a special tradition. In other words, if we examine Torah properly, we try to put it all together and not just take snippets that we want to use to prove our particular opinion, then we know that that's not a proper way to darshan the Torah. And so, all this to say, this was essentially how Chazal understood Menashe, and that's why he's Megaleh Panim b'Torah, meaning he's Megaleh Panim b'Torah. He's exposing faces or aspects of the Torah that are not intended by the Torah itself. So that's what I wanted to say about that. Um, okay. There was something else that was related, and I can't remember what it was.
Excuse me, that's very strange
Uh-huh.
because each drasha
Hmm.
can take a text and go with the text very far in a way which doesn't have anything to do with the pshat, which what is
Well,
written in the
so
Torah.
so
So
what I
that's
would tell you,
you do this every day, yes.
well, yes, yes and no. In other words, what I would say to you is, to the untrained eye, it will seem like that. So there are places that Chazal Darshan that seem removed from the simple meaning of the text. This is your claim. So I want to say two
Yeah.
things about it. So one of them is that Chazal in their drashot, even if you would argue, and I'm not, and I'll make a counter argument, but even if you would argue that they remove psukim from their pshat, from their plain meaning, but they're not like Menashe, because they're not doresh Torah lignai. That is, what motivates the drasha are elemental foundations, right? Yisodot, in their understanding of the Torah and what the Torah is trying to teach us in a general way. So the Chazal are not ever going to darshan that the Torah is telling you to do something that we know is not something the Torah wants you to do.
So
Right?
it's the content, but not the method.
Say that again. It's the content, not the
It's the
method. What do you
content
mean?
of the drasha and not the method of, to do this drasha.
I'm not sure. I'm still not sure what you're saying. What do you mean?
You say that if the drasha is positive, it's okay, but if it's negative, it's bad. So it's not the fact to do a drasha which is problematic, but it's the content. It's what
It's
you mean
okay.
it by the drasha.
Yes, yeah. Bigadol, yes. That's the content is key. In other words, what the conclusion is going to be key. When we're not going to darshan things out that we know are going to be not in line with the way Chazal conceived of Torah, the way they had Kabbalah and Masorah to understand the Torah. So we aren't going to darshan, for example, that you should worship other gods, right? Because in a sense, that one's easy, right? Because we have other azharot in the Torah that say not to.
not to do
Um,
it. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
not to do it. But in terms of your other point, it's an important point, and it's something that I think has been raised, especially by you in the past. And what I can tell you is this, when you learn drashot of Chazal, especially drashot that seem to remove a text from its plain meaning, especially in
Mhm.
those cases. So first of all, you're completely correct that you should be aware of that and understand what you thought the pshat is and what would motivate Chazal to make a drasha that seems to remove a pasuk from its pshat. But what I'll tell you is that Mefarshim throughout the ages have, in many, in different ways, have tried to demonstrate um, that Chazal's understanding was a deeper understanding. It wasn't an understanding that removed something from its original intent. This approach became really popular, I would say. I don't know, I think of a better word, but it became more pronounced, let's say, beginning in the late 18th and early 19th century. And the reason for that was because that in the late 18th century, you see the beginnings of the reform movement. Now, and here I'm not an historian, but I know a little bit that I can tell you that in the early stages of the reform movement didn't deviate. First of all, it didn't renounce halacha, and it didn't deviate from accepted halacha a lot by our standards today. But there were some deviations. The reform movement arises mainly in Germany, and it's a response to the beginning of a time when Jews are, there's a whole debate about whether Jews are essentially human enough that they should be granted equal citizenship, right? And it's not a simple debate. It's a serious debate. Moshe Mendelssohn was in the thick of that, and he wrote a book, Yerushalayim,
Yerushalayim, okay.
right, which defended the idea that Jews are, and I'm saying this, by the way, based on summaries, because I haven't learned it myself. But his book, Yerushalayim, defends the idea that Jews are essentially like any other people, meaning mainly Christians. And in the same way that Christians can be good citizens and worship the way they want to worship, Jews can do the same thing, right? Because in a Protestant environment, there is already a kind of separation between church and state. And Moshe Mendelssohn argues he lays the groundwork for an idea which now, in our time, literally in our time, is in a sense coming full circle to the other side, that he's laying the groundwork for the idea that that Judaism is primarily a religion. And the reason I say it's coming around in our day and age is because now, for various reasons, mainly because of accusations against the Jewish state, Jews are coming around to make the claim that actually we're not just a religion, that we're a people. But at the time in Europe, that was not necessarily the best thing, like the best thing to say, right? If you wanted to be a member of the society at large, so you didn't want to say that you're a member of a different people. You wanted to say, for example, if you're in Germany, you wanted to say you're German. But you could say, I wanted to say I'm a German Jew.
German of Mosaic religion.
Yes, exactly. Right. And this also came up in France, where,
Yeah,
yeah,
Israelite, yeah. Mhm.
right. And Napoleon said is essentially there's a phrase, right? I don't know if it was from Napoleon himself, but uh, it was the same idea that um, you know, Jews as Jews can't, don't deserve anything, but Jews who are, French people, they deserve everything the same as French people,
French people.
right? And of course, there's a long and bitter history to this because, Jews little by little did get accepted. And then, roughly 100 years later, toward the end of the 19th century, there was a huge amount of resentment against Jews. And this is when the term anti-Semitism is coined. And somehow Jews, no matter what we do, in other words, whether we say that we're separate or we try not to be separate, but the non-Jews will say we're separate, right? So that's a long and interesting discussion. But why am I bringing it up in this context? So that was a bit of a digression about citizenship for Jews in Europe. But the main point I was making is about what happened in the wake of the Reform movement. Now, this was also at a time at the late 18th century when you have the beginnings of what we come to call uh, biblical criticism, right? Critical theory about examining the Bible. And Jews are included in this. They're not the ones who I think who begin it, but well, it's arguable because you could argue that Spinoza already does,
Spinoza, okay.
yeah, that he already says things that could be understood in a critical fashion. Um, but this becomes more popular in the late 18th century, early 19th century. And so you have a kind of pushback from some prominent rabbanim of the time. And the most prominent ones that come to mind are the Malbim, Meir Leibush ben Yaakov Meir, who I'll explain in a second. And one of his contemporaries was Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, who wrote a sefer called Haktava HaKabbalah, which you can access completely online on Al Torah, and I think it's also on Sefaria. And what each of them were doing in their own ways, and actually, I think, I don't have access to Mendelssohn's Perush on the Torah, but I have a kind of a roundabout access because he's quoted in another sefer that I have, which is really a Perush on the Ibn Ezra. He quotes Mendelssohn a lot. But I think Mendelssohn was also, to some degree, sensitive to this, but especially if you see in the Malbim and Aktaba Kabbalah, um, I think it's clear, certainly, especially, I'd say, for the Malbim, that one of the very big motivations for him to write the Perushim that he did on the Torah was to demonstrate, he makes the claim, broadly speaking, that drashot of Chazal, far from being understandings that remove us from the original meaning of the Torah, they are actually grammatically grounded, and they point to a much deeper understanding of the Torah. So with the Malbim, and I'm saying this to you especially, Paul, like if you come across a drasha that seems especially strange, right? That seems especially removed from pshat. One of the first places I would look to get maybe a deeper understanding is to look at the Malbim and see how he understands it, because he will break it apart grammatically, and he will give his opinion. And also the Ketava Kabbalah, who also does a lot of the grammar. And I think Ketava Kabbalah is also very good when it comes to refining definitions of words. Like the difference between ani and anochi, for example. These are things that he goes into in great depth. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to demonstrate that Chazal's understanding of the Torah was much deeper than one would think. And it's not just that they're playing with words, that they were genuinely digging down deep into the meanings of the of these words in the Torah, these psukim in the Torah. And so as you know, whenever it happens, I'll try to do it here. I think we've done it to some degree in the past. But I would say to you, anytime you come across a drasha that seems especially strange, you have to see if some of these people talk about it, because they're very good at explaining them on this kind of deeper level. So it was done in a sense as a response to the rise of the Reform movement and to the Haskalah, not just the Jewish Haskalah, but the Enlightenment writ large. But nonetheless, the Perushim they are fantastic. Like they're very deep, and they're not they're not artificial, in my humble opinion. They're things that have that still resonate to this day. But
I have nothing negative Perushim. That's for me. It's okay to do a Perush, but you have to understand. But you have to do a drasha. They have nothing negative drasha, but you have to understand that it is a drasha, which is okay.
No, right. And I'm not saying that you're denying that, but what I'm saying to you is that it's just this, that drashot al pnei hashetach, you might think that that they're not motivated, or they're not grounded, I should say. They're not grounded in a close reading of the Torah, but the argument can be made that actually, or the argument has been made, especially by these Mefarshim, that it is grounded. But the other point I'll raise in this context, which is a very old question, and it's a question that any one of us still has to grapple with today, is when we talk about Pshuto Shel Mikra, then we have to ask that question: what is Pshat? What do we think Pshat means? And that in itself begs the question, right? It's not something that's obvious. And how do we know? Just, as lay people, because when we learn different perushim, and we learn the perushim that are presented as pshat perushim, for example, the Ibn Ezra and the Rashbam, and the Ramban, right? All of these people essentially present themselves as Pashtanim, and yet they can have very sharp disagreements about what psukim mean, right? And
Okay, so the pshat is not itself is not obvious in this
exactly.
thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Even though the Gemara says, it's Masechet Shabbat, I believe it says, "Ein mikra yotzei midei pshuto," and that is in response to a particular drasha. That's the idea that even if you have what we might consider, in the context of we're talking about a legitimate drasha, but that doesn't negate a simpler, like the plain meaning of a pasuk. The plain meaning of a pasuk is always there. And when you learn the Ramban, if you read the Ramban's Hakdama to Perush al Torah, he talks about why he decided to write his Perush. And one of the things he says is that the Kitzur, that he wanted to write a Perush that gives the pshat of the Torah that would be in line with his Kabbalistic understanding of the Torah. So it's very interesting, because he often argues with the Ibn Ezra. He'll often argue with the Ibn Ezra about what pshat is. Now the Ramban also, he doesn't tell us what he thinks his Kabbalistic understanding of the Torah is. He hints at it here and there. But the Ramban had a certain, broadly speaking, Kabbalistic understanding of the Torah, and he understood that in order to understand the Kabbalah properly, you have to start on a basis of Pshuto Shel Mikra. So the particular way he learned Pshat was very important to him, and it's food for a lot of interesting discussions. Okay, so I've digressed on this enough, I think. Um, okay, but anyway, I hope that people appreciate it. I don't mean that as a compliment to me, but in other words, I mean appreciate in the context of what we're learning and why this idea of Megale Panim b'Torah is a very serious thing. And I was thinking about why is it that these three things in particular, oh, that's the other Gemara I wanted to show you. So this Gemara, in our Gemara, wait, I have to see which. So this is our Gemara. Our Gemara is the one we have this Rebbe Omer, right? Kol Aveirot Shabbatorah, etc. And he says, except for these three things, Parek o Megale Panim b'Torah Mefer Brit Basar. So I wanted to show you that it also appears in Gemara and Shavuot, which I think I remember the daf. Unfortunately, I'm not one of these people who knows Shas by heart. Um, I was thinking about why these three things, which you might think that you might think that it's the three Aveirot that we learned about, right? Avodah Zarah, Shfichut Damim, Gilui Arayot. You might think that somebody's over on those, tshuva by itself won't be mechaper, because we understand that those are Ye'areg Val Ya'avor. So what is it about these three Aveirot that Rebbe thinks are things that you can never get kapara for without tshuva, right? Because otherwise you don't need tshuva. So while I'm looking for this, but does anybody have any thoughts about what makes these three things special?
Now, first you want to have three because it's a kind of a matbea.
That you want to have what? You want to have
Three of them. Three.
Oh, okay. All
Because
right.
it's a
Yesh
matbea.
lomar.
So yeah.
There's a kind of a pattern there, right? There's a kind of
Pattern, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay, yesh lomar. By the way, I think there is something to that. It's an interesting thing, also, just in general, because having three examples is a really common rhetorical device, right? It's used all the time, and we use it even to some degree, certainly in our writing and even in our speech, that we'll say this, not only this and this, but this. So there is something to be said about that. But what are these three things what do they have in common? Why would they be important?
החוט המשולש לא במהרה יקרה.
Yinatek.
ינתק, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's from right. That's what Kohelet says. So there is something to having three, but what do we think what do we think that what's the quality of these things that Rebbe picks on that would make him say that these things you can't be forgiven for without tshuva?
I mean, in some sense, all of these things are not only breaking law, but in some sense, publicly making a kind of declaration that the law does not matter, and so therefore
Okay,
maybe one.
so explain yourself.
So, like the first one, I'm thinking the first one in particular. What some if one's sort of doing something biyad rama, one's sort of flaunting the law.
Well, Yadra, that's a pasuk that we quoted, but with the three things were porek ol.
He says so. They get that was defined by porek, all casting off the yoke.
Yeah,
I forget.
so okay, so Rashi, I'll just remind you, Rashi said, oh, you weren't here last week. Parek ol. I'm sorry, I
No,
forgot
no, no,
that.
no, 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 no. It's fine.
Okay.
Actually, I probably shouldn't have gone out on a limb without when I.
Without having learned this first, but okay,
Yes. Fools go where angels fear to.
fools rush in.
Yes.
Rashi says, Pareko is kofer b'kadosh baruch Hu, that you deny you deny God. You deny God. That's Pareko. In other words, the O there is not. According to this is Rashi's understanding. Pareko isn't the O of mitzvot per se. It's the O of the O. In other words, it's the most essential yoke, and the most essential yoke is your acceptance of the existence of God, and that God. I'm adding a little bit to what Rashi says bimfurash, but it's the idea that God is God, and you have an obligation to believe in God, and therefore to accept His commandments. So that's Porekol. And Megale Panim B'Torah, Rashi said, we just explained, is Doreshet Torah Lignai. Somebody darshans the Torah in a degrading way. Mefer Brit Basar is, Paul, what's Mefer Brit Basar?
Brit Milah, I think. No, you don't do Brit Milah to your son. I think so. No,
Right?
no?
Yes, yeah, right. Right? Mila of Masechet Shavuot, Rashi says, Yelifim Mikrai, right? So those three things, denying God, darshaning the Torah in a degrading way, and essentially denying or undoing the Brit Milah. So what is it about these three things that you think would make Rebbe say that these three things you can't get kapara for without doing tshuva? Now you can think about it a little bit more, Michael, but seriously, now that you know what
And
the things mean, right? So then you can,
I have this bad habit of taking educated guesses, or not so educated guesses.
or not, maybe not so educated guesses. Like
Um,
we call that, the technical term is shooting from the hip, I think
um,
is
yes,
sometimes.
as we say back in the old country. Yes.
So
Um,
sometimes that works, but as a general rule, it's not
is
it's
to be
not a
discouraged.
yeah. And now I'm being serious, and the reason it's discouraged is because you can start. If you start off with a false foundation or an incorrect foundation, it will inevitably lead you away from what is true. So even though I could certainly argue that the term porek ol could mean something other than what Rashi said, but let's go with what Rashi said. And Megale Panim B'Torah, I think, is muchach. Like I think it's proven from the Gemara that Rashi references. And Mefer Brit, that seems to be the easiest, the clearest. Or it's somebody who denies or is violates the brit of circumcision. So, what do you think these three things have in common that would make you have to do tshuva in order to get kapara, as opposed to presumably all other mitzvot, which, according to Rebbe, Yom Kippurim itself is michaper, and even without tshuva. So I'm willing to
Well, I
take.
guess if you do these things, you leave the um, Yahadut. You are no more real Jew or a Jew at all. So you have to come back to Judaism to get kapara. A person who doesn't do Brit Milah to his son, he's not going to come to the Bet Knesset anyway. So
Presumably, yeah, right.
presumably, yeah, I
Yeah.
guess. No, I don't know.
No, I think that's not an unreasonable, it's not an unreasonable thing. But
Mhm.
so in terms of uh, oh, that's not what I'm looking for. In so basically, I would say yes. In other words, I essentially, I think that the point is, see if let's go through one by one. If you're porek ol, if you deny Kadosh Baruch Hu, which could mean you deny the existence of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, or that you deny that the Kadosh Baruch Hu, maybe you believe there's a Kadosh Baruch Hu, but that you have no relationship with him in that sense. So you deny his uh, kingship over you, his shlita. Uh, but it's this, back in ancient times, um, uh, atheism as such didn't mean that you didn't believe in God. It meant that you weren't connected to any God.
Make it some you are adoring some other gods, or the gods of the Romans, or something like this.
Okay, well, that's already a theism, right? In other words, that means that you're Oved Avodah Zarah, but atheism just meant that you didn't feel yourself connected to any of the gods.
At that time of the Mishnah.
Yeah, I'm basing that on a book by, oh gosh, now I can't remember her name. There's a book called The History of God I read a long time ago, and she goes
Okay,
through
Karen Armstrong.
Yeah, it was written by Karen Armstrong. Thank you. I remember the K. And she goes through this history and she says, atheism, as we think of it, which is the denial of the existence of God altogether. I think that doesn't come up as a concept, I think, until either after the Renaissance, pre-Enlightenment, Enlightenment. It's that time, and even then, at that time, it's very controversial. Most people do still believe in God, but that idea is raised. So I'm just mentioning Porek Ol, Kofer b'Kadosh Baruch Hu could mean that you deny the existence of God, but could also just mean that you deny the Malchut of God. You deny your connection to God. So
I mean, I'm thinking of Paro. Basically,
yeah.
who's this God that I should be listening to? And he's basically, in some sense, he's deifying himself.
Yeah, so actually yes, I think that's a very good example, right? So Paro is actually a classic example of Kofer Bakadosh Baruch Hu, that he denies that God has. First, he doesn't know who God is, but at some point he starts to understand who God is, but he still wants to deny the power of God. He wants to deny the Malchut of God. And presumably, one of the reasons is because Paro wants to see himself as God. But so if you're a kofer b'Kadosh Baruch Hu, that's not why. So just think about it. Why would you have to do tshuva in order to get kapara from that? Go ahead.
Tshuva is a public recognition of God's shlita, among other things.
Okay. You're saying what it does. Why is it Poreko has to have tshuva and it's not subsumed under the kapara of Yom Kippurim?
It's a conscious act on one's part.
Say that again?
It's a conscious act on one's part, and therefore one has to do a conscious act of tshuva to repair it.
Well, but I could say that about any avon that's b'mezid. What's a conscious act? What are you saying explicitly?
To just deny the existence of God is like a stand. It's not simply I'm not going to keep Shabbat, but it's a stand, a belief.
Okay.
Not a belief, a belief, a specific belief. God doesn't exist.
Okay, and so what's exceptional about that particular belief in this context? I think you're all kind of dancing around this.
You are leaving the Moadon, so you have to come back to the Moadon.
You're leaving the club, so you have to come back to the club.
Yeah.
No, but I understand what you're saying. Look, the way I would put it is this. If you deny God, either his existence or his malchut, right? Or, that the fact that you have some obligation to God. So then essentially you are denying all the mitzvot. It's not the same as saying, I believe in God. I believe that God gave us the Torah. But I feel like eating a ham sandwich. So the idea that, in other words, this is, I think, the point of what Paul is saying. In other words, this is what right? This is what you mean. If you leave the club, what does it mean you leave the club? It means you've excluded yourself from the entire world that God has set before you. In other words, the entire corpus of the Torah and all of the mitzvot and all of the tradition. If you're polek, you're not in there at all. So you can't, so included in that, by the way, it means that you yourself you yourself have no connection anymore to Yom Kippurim. So let's say, Paul, what you said earlier, I'll just modify it a little bit. So technically, halachically, you're still a Jew. But, from the point of view of Shamayim, you have now excluded yourself. You've taken yourself away. And v'chein hala. So then that's the most, I think, porekol in that sense is the most basic. And it seems to me then that has to be obvious that you will never get kapara unless you do tshuva, which would mean, picking up on what I think Michael Schwartz said, in other words, you have to do some kind of a conscious act or change your consciousness to a state where in principle, you are willing to recognize God and therefore willing to recognize His Torah. So I think that's the most basic. So then we have Megale Panim b'Torah, that's to darshan the Torah l'gnai. So why is that something that you have to do tshuva for, and it's not subsumed under Yom Kippurim?
I mean, in some sense, like the first one, it's not only violating a mitzvah, but in some sense, it's undermining the very concept of mitzvah and the very possibility of kapara.
Okay, so I want you to expand on that. What do you mean it undermines the possibility? It undermines the concept of mitzvah.
If you can serve your darshan the Torah in any way you choose, then there really are no. You can basically say what it basically says. Whatever you say it says, and so there aren't. Yeah.
Yeah, so that right. And if you're megale panim b'Torah, that means that actually the Torah can mean whatever you want. In which case, it's also a kind of exclusion. In other words, you're not putting yourself within the rubric of the Torah in the way that God gave it to us, in the way that's intended. And of course, because we learn Mishnah and Gemara, of course we know that within that rubric there is essentially infinite possibility, right? You can argue about what things mean, for now and forever. But in order for it to be Torah, qua Torah, it has to be within certain boundaries. So if you're megare panim b'Torah, you're what you're saying. I like the way just to modify a little bit what you're saying. But in other words, it means there are no boundaries, which means essentially, if any interpretation of Torah, if all interpretations of Torah are equal, that means that none of them has any primacy, and then none of them are particularly important. And then the last one, I think, in this sense, is very interesting. So mefer brit, somebody who denies the brit of brit milah. How would you fit that in?
I mean, some just think there's no past and there's no future. You're basically denying the very, very first mitzvah, and you're also suggesting there's no future. You're basically, you're basically putting your offspring outside the Brit.
Very interesting. Yeah, I like the, yeah, it's very interesting. Um, no, I think it's good. It wasn't the way I was thinking about it, but I think, yeah, I think that's actually a very good way of saying it. By the way, I don't have a particular way that I was thinking about. I was thinking about it in the sense that uh, Brit Milah is, it's the as I'm thinking about it, it's connected to what you're saying, right? The idea is that Brit Milah this is a mitzvah that Kadosh Baruch Hu gives to Abraham. Um, okay, you'll pardon me because I'm kind of thinking this off the top of my head. So before the Brit Milah, Abraham already has the Brit Bein HaBetarim, right? So there's already a Brit between Abraham and Hashem with the Brit Bein HaBetarim. But the Brit Bein HaBetarim is a one-time act. It happens that one time. Hashem tells Abraham, go and get these animals and cut them in half, and we make you and I will make a brit. But when Hashem gives brit milah to Abraham, he's saying, this is something that will begin with you, but it goes on forever, and it's a grounding of the basic brit between a Kadosh Baruch Hu and Abraham, who is the father of us all. And so if you either aren't Mekayem or you're Mefer the Brit, or in other words, meaning that you somehow undo it, either physically or by denying it, you're denying that there's a special relationship between the Jewish people and the Kadosh Baruch Hu, which is also another way of putting yourself, to borrow Paul's phrase, of putting yourself out of the club. You're saying this is not important, or or it has no meaning, and so therefore I'm not really part of this whole community, and therefore I'm not part of the discussion. So all of these three things, in one way or another, remove you from Klal Yisrael, and remove you, maybe in a more pointed way, they remove you from your relationship to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So if you have no relationship to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, then Yom Kippurim isn't going to cut it for you, because you're completely disconnected. So if you do other averot, you still haven't disconnected yourself from the Kadosh Baruch Hu and from Klal Yisrael. But if you do any of these three things, you're so disconnected that the only way that you'll ever get kapara is you have to find your way back. You have to do tshuva. You literally have to come back to a starting point that you have chosen to leave. That's my quick take. But and if you have other thoughts about it, and it doesn't have to be right now, but I think this is I think it's a really important. I think this is a very important concept. This whole concept, I think, is a very important concept.
I wanted to add that. Oh,
go ahead, please.
Oh, there we go. I wanted to add that the first one, Mefarok Ol, is an act of the heart. The Megale Panim B'Torah is an act of the head, and the Mefer Brit is an act of the body.
Wow, very
nice,
good.
very nice.
Mamash tov. Yeah, very, very good. I think that's a really good point. So yeah, something to think about because, and we're gonna do a little bit more of this week, because I keep saying to you, I want to show you what Rav Soloveitchik says about Rebbe. But this is so the whole position of Rebbe, as we understand it, which is right. So Rebbe understands that Yom Kippurim gives you kapara even without tshuva. So, and we said, that to us, this seems like a very strange concept. But see, if we understand now what the exceptions are, so maybe we can understand how Yom Kippurim is mechaper even without tshuva, because the exceptions are the things that have to have tshuva are these things that essentially cut you off from the Kadosh Baruch Hu, from Chal Yisrael, from the relationship between Bnei Israel and the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So if you're so completely cut off, so of course you have to do tshuva. So mishtameh, right? So the implication is that uh, as long as you haven't violated these three things, you're still in the moadon, right? You're still in the club. You still have these relationships. Maybe you have not uh, attended to these relationships in a proper way, but you're still included enough that you can get kapara from Yom Kippurim. And actually, now that I've said that, this is a very good segue into what Rav Soloveitchik said. And I have to bring up that screen. So just a second. I was going to show you this Gemara, this Braita of Rebbe also appears in Masechet Shavuot. I was going to show it to you there, but I think we'll skip that at least for the moment. And I'll bring up the screen with Al HaTshuva. Rak shniya. Let's see if I can find it. I know it's here. Uh, did I send that out to you? No, because I thought that's my fault. Because I said if I can, I'll send it out to you. One sec. I'm sorry. Hold on a second.
Search.
Here we go. Okay, just give a second and the screen will come up. And now it's very late. So we'll just start this. And I will, B'li Neder, I'll send it out to you. You can read it. So let me make sure you see the right screen. Yeah, okay. So this is from page 81 in Al HaTshuva. And as I mentioned last time, this is not the beginning, right? This is kind of the middle of the chapter that Rav Soloveitchik is talking about here. And what the theme that he's been building is the idea that there's such a thing as a tzibur, right? There's a community or a kahal, like the wider Jewish community. And we're also individuals, right? So when we daven on Yom Kippurim in the bracha, what do we say? That we talk about both. We talk about both ourselves as individuals and as Klal Yisrael. And so he says here, I'm gonna read and we'll fit it in. It says Aleinu la'ayin ata b'halacha shekava Rebbe. So now we have to look closely at this halacha that was determined by Rebbe, which says, and he quotes our Braita, Al kol aveirot shebatorah ben asat tshuva ben lo asat tshuva Yoma Kippurim mechaper. Okay, so that's Rebbe's shita on every transgression in the Torah, whether you did tshuva or whether you didn't do tshuva, Yom HaKippurim brings atonement. So, next page. Oops, I'm sorry, hold on. I think I skipped a word. Oy. Yeah. So that's what Rebbe says. Aliba the Rebbe. So according to Rebbe, what does this mean? It implies afil asabo malacha. Even if you did malacha on Yom Kippurim, afil omeid b'merdo, and even if you stand in your state of defiance, of rebelliousness, Yom Kippurim mechaper. So now he says, Kaparat Yom Kippurim uvenet lanu. So the atonement of Yom Kippurim is understood to us, imanu koshrim ota imat tshuva. If we connect it to, if we tie it to tshuva, hakarat achet, charata ahavar, kabbalah le'atid, right? These things, the recognition of sin, the regret of sin, and the acceptance upon yourself not to repeat the sin in the future, machshirot et adam lekabara. They prepare someone, they prepare a person for kapara. Yesh b'zeh higayon mesuyam, right? There's a certain logic to this. How do we understand the Yom Kippurim of Rebbe? Yom Kippurim lelo tshuva, if Yom Kippurim without tshuva, without vidui, without ta'anit, without tefillah, when the sinner, I'm just going to do a little freelance on-the-spot translation. When the sinner still stands in his defiance and he kicks at Yom Kippurim, right? He's pushing away Yom Kippurim. Lama sheyichupar? Lama sheyichupar lo? Why should Yom Kippurim have any effect to grant him kapara? So then he quotes from the Tosfos Yeshanim that we looked at a little bit last time. It says, right, Be'etzem, right, and basically we find this wonderment, right, this question, not intentionally, or it's not the main question that Tosfos intended to ask, but we find it in this Tosfos Yeshanim, and they say in the Fi Rebbe, right, according to Rebbe, if it's true that Yom Kippurim brings kapara without tshuva or without fasting or without davening, why do we say in our tefillah, Mimnei chataenu galinu me'artzeinu? Because of our sins, we were expelled from our country. What's the problem? Hare Yom Kippurim be'etzem bo'o kvar machat chataim, because when Yom Kippurim, just by the very fact that it came, it wiped out our sins. Even as it were against somebody's will, where it's willy-nilly, it wipes out our sins. So then, why was the Beit HaMikdash destroyed for our sins? If Rebbe is correct, then history doesn't make sense, and our davening doesn't make sense. So Tosfos says that tshuva ha'olah midivrei Tosfos. So the answer that comes out of Tosfos is that כי גם לרבי אין כאן כפרה גמורה, אלא מקצת כפרה בלבד. Even according to Rebbe, you don't get a whole kapara, you'll get a partial kapara. So now, and I saw Paul, I saw you waving your head, but this is what he's going to explain.
What does this mean?
That's exactly the point. Now he's going to explain what it means. And it is very important, because otherwise say, okay, so, but no. And this is a question that we already posed to ourselves, right? From the Gemara that we already learned. The Gemara already talks about this idea of kapara sheina gemura, right? That Nasham Talui, Gemara says, gives you a kapara sheina gemura. And so in that context, in the context of Asham Talui, what we understood that to mean, that I think one of you used, that maybe it was Michael Werner used this term of the suspended sentence. So in other words, you're caught, in the case of the Asham Talui, you're caught in a state where you may have sinned, but you're not sure. And so by bringing the Asham Talui, if you are obliged to bring a korban chatat and you don't know it, the Asham Talui will keep you in this suspended state where you will not be punished. So it gives you, so that's considered to be a kapara sheina gemura, but it's miktzat kapara. It gives you some kind of kapara. We have to talk about the term kapara altogether, and I just want to finish a little bit more of what he's saying, but remind me. Let's talk about the word kapara in a minute. So he says, so now the next question is Paul's question. We have to understand that ma perush miktzat kapara, o sheyesh kapara, o shein kapara. Either you get kapara, either you get atonement, or you don't. נראה לי איפה, כי דברי רבי האומר יום הכיפורים מכפר גם ללא תשובה. So it seems to me that the words of Rebbe, who says that Yom Kippurim brings atonement without tshuva, מתייחסים אך ורק לאחת משתי הכפרות הכרוכות ביום הכיפורים. It refers to one of two atonements that are bound up with Yom Kippurim. And what are those? Halohein kaparata yachid, the kaparata tzibur. And as I say, so the Perek until now in this book, he has been building up this concept of the yachid and the rabbim, the individual and the general community. So we all exist in both of those spheres. We exist as individuals before the Kadosh Baruch Hu, but we also exist as part of a whole. And this is a very important thing. It's a very it's a theme that comes up especially on Yom Kippurim, and we'll get to some more of those examples. He's going to talk a little bit more about it now. But before I go on, before I forget, I just want to mention something about the word kapara. So what's the root of the word kapara? There's actually
to cover over.
Where do you get that from?
Well, I'm thinking of actually some context. I mean, I know that when one slaughters an animal, in the field, one basically lets his blood spill, and one covers it with dirt.
Yeah, but where's the word? How does that connect it to the word kapara?
Well, also it's the kofer, like the cover.
Kafar doesn't mean to cover.
Oh, really? Okay, then I'm wrong then.
No, okay. I wasn't sure.
Kaporet, no?
Kaporet is a covering.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm trying to think of. What I think it relates to is the word kofer. By the way, you know what? Billy Nether will go deeper. I didn't prepare that this week, but let's go deeper into these words that seem to come from the kaffe resh. But what is kofer?
It's money you pay to wipe out your transgression.
Okay, well, one of the translations of kofir is a ransom, right? In other words, kofir,
לשלם
right?
כופר, כן, כן.
L'shalem kofir. In the Torah, you
Mhm.
say, "Lo tikach kofir lenefesh rotzeach." You're not allowed to
Mhm.
accept kofir, which would be like blood money. It would be, in other words, you're not allowed to accept money to exempt somebody who committed murder. And the Torah points that out explicitly. I have a lot to say about that. I don't want to digress. But so the idea of I think this is the point that I want to make. The kofir and kapara are related. Kofir indicates something, usually money, that you give in exchange for being relieved of a punishment. You give kofir in order to avoid punishment. So when you're granted kapara, you're being given, to borrow a term that I think has a lot of Christian overtones in English, but you're getting a kind of a grace. But actually, it's not even good. It's not a good term because grace has other. No, that's
Redemption.
No, it's not. I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's not what I'm looking for. But the idea is that the idea of kapara is that when you're granted kapara, and Rav Soloveitchik talks about this much earlier in the book, you are now disconnected from your sin. And one of the things he says earlier, and I'm not going to be able to quote him exactly, but he talks about this idea, Chet exists as a kind of a debt. It's similar to a debt. Think of a monetary debt. If you have a monetary debt, there are two ways that you can rid yourself of that, be rid of the debt. One is that you pay it back. And the other way is if the debtor cancels your debt, right? That both of those ways you are now disconnected from the debt. So hate is a similar situation, and it's important to remember when you've sinned, even if to skip to the end, even if you get kapara, it's not that it doesn't mean the sin never happened. The sin exists in the universe in some way. But what it means is you're no longer connected to that sin. It's as if your debt is canceled. You are no longer connected. You don't have that debt anymore. And so this I think is the most basic idea of kapara. When you have to, what are we striving for? We brought this up a little bit last week, and it's something that we still have to delve into more, in my opinion. But the idea, like we keep saying, Yom Kippur means mechaper, Ki b'yom hazeh yechaper alechem, and so on and so forth. But what is kapara after all? So kapara, I think on the most basic level, means that you're now disconnected from your sin. And why do I care about that? Because I want to be in this more pure state vis-a-vis the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and I would add, and therefore vis-a-vis the rest of the universe, the rest of the world, including my fellow man and all of existence. In other words, what do we say? Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. Renew our days as of Kedem, which was, going back to Gan Eden, that we would like to be able to exist in a state where we are without sin, and therefore we are much closer to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And I think if we're much closer to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, then we're all closer to each other. You can think about that.
How would you connect kapara with chanina? Well, I was talking a lot about chanina today.
Yes, why?
Well, who wants chanina?
Oh. Okay.
Is it not the same kind of wiping it out of the pinkas, this kapara? It's like a hayad roshemet, כן? So if you do kapara, so you wipe this line.
Right. It's interesting that you bring it up, because why did I stop when I said I don't want to use the word grace in English for kapara? Because I think the translation of chanina would be grace. That's really the translation. The idea of chanina, where do we see chanina in the Torah, right? We see Va'et Hanan, right? That Moshe says that Hitchananti. And Hitchananti, the way we understand it in context, the way Chazal understand it, is that's when you're asking for chanina, what you're asking for is exactly what Paul said now. You're asking that your sin is wiped out, despite the fact that you have no particular merits. You can't bring anything to the table that would warrant your din being wiped out. And that's what makes it chanina. Chanina means essentially the God is giving you something for nothing. So that's not the same. I think I'm glad you brought it up, right? Because we can contrast that now with kapara. Kapara is not something that God grants just stam. God only grants kapara when you've done the work. Except, okay, and I think we're going to leave off here, okay, but this, so it sharpens the question about Rebbe, because Rebbe says there is such a thing as kapara that you get without doing the work. So what we see here,
Yom Kippur, yeah.
because Yom Kippurim is mechaper afilu lo tshuva, right? But what Rav Soloveitchik is going to argue...
So it's a kind of chanina. Yom Kippur is a kind of chanina.
It's a kind of chanina, but the way Rav Soloveitchik is going to understand it, he just introduced it to us. He's going to say that because of the qualitative difference between the yachid and the rabbim, right, the individual and the masses, the way he's going to understand Rebbe, and what Tosfos says, that when Tosfos brings up this idea of miktzat kapara, that Rebbe says you'll get miktzat kapara, he's going to say that you as an individual, because you didn't do tshuva, you will not be granted kapara as an individual. But because you are still part of the klal, you're still part of the rabbim, so you will get some kind of a reflection of kapara that came just because you're part of the klal, because you're part of the rabbim. So I'm going to leave it at that. We'll read more next time, and I'll try to I thought I did this last week. I'll try to remember. I'll send you these pages.
That's like a memorandum.
What do you mean?
There are such things that maybe when a new king starts, so he can wipe away all the averot of all the people in his country, something like this.
Uh-huh.
I think it's called memorandum or something like this.
No, actually, in English we'd say general amnesty.
General amnesty.
Maybe in English, maybe it's in French.
I was going to say,
check it,
yes. Yeah, I have a feeling that you're right, that you're referring to maybe a French term. So yeah, I'd be happy to hear it. By the way, this is
maybe yes, it's an amnesty for a general amnesty. Yes,
there's a general amnesty. So the basic argument that he's going to make is that there is a kind that you will be a beneficiary, as it were, of this general amnesty. You'll be the beneficiary of this kapara that was granted to the klal, but it doesn't actually exempt you for your individual. It doesn't take away your individual responsibility. That's the point. You don't get You don't get a kapara gemura as an individual. You'll get a kapara klalit. And what difference does that make? We'll talk more about it next time. We'll talk more about it next. He talks about it, but it has to do with it. It has to do with an idea which we'll learn also from the Rambam, that that Kadosh Baruch Hu made a promise that he will never wipe out Bnei Yisrael. So that doesn't mean he can't wipe you out. You're part of Bnei Yisrael, but you're under the umbrella of Bnei Yisrael. So he can never wipe out everyone. But I mean, I'm taking an extreme stance here. But that doesn't necessarily cover you as an individual. And this is the theme that Rosh Soloveitchik is going to build up on, that there's a difference between you as a Yachid and you as a member of the Rabbim. When you're a member of the Rabbim, yes, you get certain zchuyot, you have certain privileges just because you're a part of Bnei Yisrael. But it doesn't mean that you're relieved of all responsibilities as an individual. I think that's a good place to stop. And yes, and that anyone who has time, and if I remember to send these out, read this. It's not that much more to read. It's, as I say, it's part of a longer discussion, but worth reading. Okay, thanks everybody. This was very interesting. Have a good week. Have a Purim Sameach. Wait a second. When is Purim?
It's Purim. So
Purim
we'll be
Yeah, but-
shiur on Shushan Purim.
Yeah,
Shushan Purim is when? Tuesday night, Wednesday, right?
Yes.
Yes, Wednesday.
So in
So-
theory, we could do shiur on Wednesday night.
I have, listen, I just, of course, as usual, I hadn't thought about this in advance. 1 second.
I mean, this does not seem like a good year to get drunk. Right?
Yes, I guess we're in it. We should be in a, I was going to say, we might say a state of high alert. Let's say a state of higher consciousness.
Yes.
Given our current political position. So listen, Purim will be over at 6:03. From my point of view, I'm perfectly willing to give shiur next week, provided that you want to come. If you think you would rather not, it's also okay with me. We can take a week off. But let's take who thinks that they would come, or if you're not sure, you can also say you're not sure. Paul, I think you're really not sure, right?
Not sure. No, but I have to check with the family what's going to
Yeah,
be.
you know what, Paul? I have a feeling you're not going to make it, right? Because if you have Sunat Purim with the family, they're not all going to pack up and leave.
Usually we have, yes.
Yeah, so that's the thing. You should enjoy that. Michael Werner, you're raising your hand for what?
I'm sure I could be there. Yeah.
You could come. And Michael Schwartz, what do you think?
I don't have a problem. I'm not doing.
He has no Shoshan Purim.
Oh, that's right. You're the odd man out.
Yeah. So for me, it's okay. It's a.
So you're actually out in the galut. Yes.
I'm in the galut. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we know that you won't be hung over by that. So
I hope not.
Yeah. So if you're hungover, bringing a sham to Louis.
Okay, so listen, I think I will give next week. If I change my mind, I'll let you know. Okay? All right.
Good night.
So
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, Chag
Shabbat Shalom.
Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Bye-bye.
Chag Sameach.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.